But to see you all in three-dimensional reality is a joy. So I'm glad we're back in person for this. And I really appreciated Quinn's presentation because she'll notice that I have the what, but I also have the why. And we're going to talk a little bit about why I think the digital supply chain is important to us as DAM practitioners. And I'm also going to add a little bit of the where, since we have the why and the how and the what, and the digital supply chain is going to be a little bit about the where. I only have 6 slides, if you don't include this one and the thank you slide. So I'm hoping that this will become a bit of a dialogue so you can help me understand, first of all, does it resonate with you? And second of all, what are you doing or have you done to influence your organizations to think of it as a digital supply chain? And I'll start with what is a digital supply chain, because when I left consulting to go to HarperCollins, I was pulled out of IT to set up a team to work on emerging technology. And one of the things we were doing is to help the chief marketing officer and the chief digital officer bring new products to market. And I had introduced the idea of a digital supply chain. And my boss was previously his job, he was now kind of like the COO, that wasn't exactly his title. But he used to be our supply chain guy. And he's like, what are you talking about? Like, what's a digital supply? There's no such thing as a digital supply chain. Because he understood physical supply chain. And this was more than 10 or 15 years ago or so. And to me, it was so obvious, having been doing DAM for 7, 8, 9, 10 years at that point, that, yeah, we get stuff, and then we put it through various processes, and we deliver it somewhere. Like, that's a supply chain. And it took me a long time, and I don't think I ever won him over. I don't think he was ever convinced there was such a thing called digital supply chain. But lo and behold, fast forward the tape, I go to work at AMC Networks, went back to consulting for another tour of duty, went to AMC Networks and said the same thing to my boss. We were putting in a big media asset management system and started talking about the digital supply chain. He's like, the what? He changed my title to head of digital supply chain and technologies and architecture. So he got it. Fast forward the tape a little more, I go to Southern New Hampshire University, and I'm in the interview process with the president and the COO. And they say, do you think there are any disadvantages to you coming from media to education? And I was like, well, we take content in media and try to get the best content and put it in front of the right eyeballs. That's what we're doing in education, with just more at stake. We're trying to get learning content in front of the right eyeballs in the right format in the right way. And that's the digital supply chain challenge. And they both were like, a what? And so what's a digital supply chain? So the reason for this presentation is I started talking about this with my team, and one of my team members came to me, very smart solution architect, and she said, what do you mean by digital supply chain? Because I Googled that, and I got weird responses. So if you Google digital supply chain, ironically, you will get a whole bunch of information on how to digitize your physical supply chain. And that's what's confusing to people. Well, the good news is that at least folks are starting to recognize there's a digital in the supply chain. But you have to go look for media supply chain if you want to find something that resonates around content. The problem is we're throwing the baby out with the bathwater, because media supply chain is much more specific, and you may or may not learn a lot of the lessons that come out of physical supply chains that have been around for a very long time and are very good at moving things from point A to point B, typically through a bunch of value-added processes, typically in partnership with folks that are outside your organization, inside your organization, and outside your organization. And so if we don't look to lessons learned and continued lessons being learned in physical supply chain management, because they've had a head start on us. They were here before digital was. I also, by the way, love the story that someone said, when the digital watch was invented, we called it a digital watch. Well, now we just call it a watch. Or we call it a smart watch. And in some number of years, it's going to be back to being a watch. So at some point, we're going to shed this concept of digital and this confusion around it, because it's going to be back to, it's so pervasive, it's a supply chain. But not everyone's going to see it that way. And there's an opportunity for each of you, if you look through that lens and start to take a look at traditional physical supply chain objectives and start to apply them to what you're doing in the dam space, you could engage in a much more thoughtful and impactful dialogue with your business. And that's why I'm hoping we get to something more conversational, because maybe you're already having those conversations. But Quinn talked about the what, and when we focus on the what is, and I used to joke around, the dam is where you put all your stuff in one place. But you don't put it in one place as a goal. You put it in one place so people can find it and people can reuse it and people can exploit it. And you don't put it in one place as a final event. It should be an initiating event. But also to leverage what Quinn was saying, if as dam practitioners and managers of dams, if we don't understand the why for that asset, if we don't know why it was purchased, it's going to be very hard to exploit it as a what, and very hard to understand where it has to go when it's not inside your dam. So there's an element of getting involved in the planning and the sourcing, and a physical supply chain that you're optimizing moves way upstream into strategic partnerships on where your stuff comes from. So where do your assets come from? The other thing is, and we immediately get bound up in all kinds of friction, meaning can we describe the assets? Can we apply metadata to it so that we can set the asset free? I have the good fortune and was invited by David, and shameless plug for the dam certificate course at Rutgers, but I get to teach an elective in rights management, and it's all about friction. We have rights to use this media, but rights management creates friction. So does poor metadata, creates friction. Visibility and risk management is another big objective in physical supply chains, and the pandemic laid that bare. Do I know where my stuff is, and am I at risk of getting my stuff? Well, that's the same challenge you face with your dam users. Do they know what it is? Good metadata. Do they know what the rights are to it? Can they get to that stuff and use it with the intention that it was purchased for? Then we have supplier performance. Getting inside the various actors within your digital supply chain or media supply chain. What are their roles? What is their value that they contribute to the process? And are they also potentially experiencing and or creating friction in your digital supply chain based on the way they're interacting with it? And then maybe most importantly, I would argue most importantly, because it gets back to that intentional use, what do your customers need? And it's not just your outside customers that are going to interact with your brand. It's your inside customers that use your dam. What do they need to get the right asset into the right place at the right time with the best intention? Meaning, do they understand the purpose of this asset and how they're allowed to use it, rights, but how they can most effectively use it, outcomes, meet the customer's needs, power a brand, power a marketing or a sales event. And in the business I was in, media, the media was the product. So it was very important to understand, especially as you were moving into different channels. Again, supply chain problem. Where does this content show up? How does it manifest? So again, we could look to some of the typical supply chain challenges that they've been staring down for the last 20 years since the internet arrived on the scene. E-commerce, busted out, and now suddenly you didn't have to go to a store. They had to start dealing with other types of challenges. You look at what Amazon has done to create inventory and proximity to customers to make it easier. How many of you are incredibly disappointed if you don't get what you want from Amazon the next day? I mean, that's crazy. And reminds me of how old I am. The only thing that reminds me more is Rock'em Sock'em Robots. Nice one. That was really good, but thank you for that. This idea of centralized inventory, put all of our stuff in one place. Well, it needs to be in a lot of places. So how do we make sure that putting it all in one place isn't a dead letter office, that we didn't get it all there, mission accomplished, done. And then the limited or insufficient visibility, meaning can you see what's going on with the assets? And again, these are all physical, traditional, typical supply chain challenges that they still are staring down with new techniques. And patchwork logistics, how is this knitted together? And so I'd like to hopefully spur your thinking to say, what's going on in a physical supply chain and what can I draw from that? So are we starting to understand that in a world that's powered by e-commerce, where almost every brand, almost every product, we experience it digitally before we experience it physically, unless you're my wife who loves to go shopping in reality, not online. But anyway, there's this new customer interactions that are powered by this e-commerce experience, and they require rich digital experiences to draw you into those brands. The inventory shortages, the analogy we could have there is, can our folks get to the content, or is rights getting in the way? Are we creating out our own digital asset inventory shortages because we don't know where that content is or how to get to it? Again, access to the dam. If it's all in one place, but people don't know how to navigate it or don't know how to get the appropriate access just to the assets themselves, or have we over-centralized and not set the assets free? And then visibility, already mentioned, around metadata that drives search, searchability, and the ability to find them. And then patchwork logistics is about expanding beyond your view of the assets in the dam into who are the other actors? How are they involved? What are their needs beyond just getting in and out of the dam? What are their contributions and what are their needs? Because everything they do affects what other people are able to do. This is maybe a little bit eye candy, but on the left you can kind of see a linear traditional supply chain. And that's the way things used to work, right? Things started here, they went through a series of processes, and they ended up there. But in a modern world, and again, still talking about physical supply chains, they had to move to a network model because we are living in a world that requires more agility and speed. We can't wait for things to go through a process, rinse, repeat. We need to be in a world where we have access to real-time information across our entire supply chain. I'm going to give another plug for the first project I ever did in DAM was with David. It was at Time Warner Book Group with Paul Gore, who unfortunately wasn't here. I was hoping to see him. He works for Fidel. If there was a DAM Hall of Fame, I'd nominate Paul Gore to be in it. Paul, when he was the client, I was the consultant, and he had this interesting way for us to go about instantiating the DAM at Time Warner Book Group, and it was called a spider chart. So it kind of got to the point here, which was we put the asset in the middle of the spider chart, and then we went and talked to everyone who interacted with that asset. So that looked like a multi-legged spider, so it was called a spider chart. And it was really interesting to bring people together, multidisciplinary people, and talk about how they looked at the asset. Because it was very different than if you went to an art director or if you went to a publicist or a production person. And you bring them all together and they each got to hear each other's stories on how that asset looked from their perspective. It was amazing how much more information we gained about what that asset needed in terms of DAM services, in terms of metadata, in terms of visibility. But it was sort of a networked approach. Take a bunch of participants and say, when you stare at, and we did it for all of the major asset types. It was quite a labor of love. But why does this matter to us when we, again, say, let's learn some lessons from physical supply chain challenges, but we now have connected customers that are constantly needing updates in the information we provide them, and they give us feedback, very often real-time feedback. I like it, I don't like it. We need to be able to respond to that much more quickly than send it back to the beginning and let's go through this process all over again. So we need faster product development. We need faster time to market in terms of distribution. We need to update what we're doing in marketing and sales cycles to reflect what the market is looking for, because they expect the package to arrive the next day, but they don't buy the package if they don't really connect, and Quinn brought that to life as well. So I think that you'll find that there's a lot to learn from the physical supply chains, but the idea of what's coming next. I took these quotes because I thought it was fun to drill down into the physical supply chain side of the Google search. But these quotes are about physical supply chain challenges, and I only highlighted some of the words. But some of the things they continue to talk about is workflow automation, new AI capabilities. For them, it is very much about taking bodies out of the process and putting automated agents in. But that's been a holy grail for us since the beginning of time, right? How can we auto-assign metadata? I walked by one of the vendors out there, and I wish I could plug them with the name, but it was AI-powered visual search. Well, wouldn't it be great if all of your assets were pre-inventoried with assignable metadata before they even got to someone who would qualify that all the time? I know some of you are doing these things already. And I remember, David, you had the great story about Mechanical Turk, where they were doing visual assignment, and that had a combination of both people and technology to do assignment of metadata through a crowdsourced marketplace. But workflow and automation, data-driven decision-making, are you looking at data that comes out of your DAM usage that starts to inform where there are points of friction, where there are points of value creation? And are you prepared to lead your workforce through the next gen of DAM technologies? Because they will need to know more about some of these things. That this is what's coming. It's been in the physical supply chain for some time. They probably have somewhat of a head start because it's table stakes for them to leverage technology to wring every last nickel out of their supply chain practices. So to get sort of practical, what can you do to start to, if you're not already doing this, and again, would love to hear your stories. But I've been promoting this concept for quite some time now, probably for the last 5 years. And I have not seen it done as often as it should be. But it's what I call a sources and uses study. Do folks know where their content comes from, the why of the content? Do you know literally where it comes from at its initial origination, an idea or a thought bubble? And then do you know how it's used throughout the entire process? And do that for your metadata as well. Do you know where it comes from, and do you know where it goes to? I'm amazed. I used to do ERP back in the 90s, where master data management wasn't called that in the 90s, I don't think. Maybe that's when they started calling it that. But it was where they started to run into data lineage problems, because you had an integrated system now, and if someone thought it meant something in the logistics part of the system, and someone thought that field meant something different in the sales part, now you had a disconnect. And God forbid you printed it on a report, because we did still print things on paper back then. You had a miscommunication because you didn't have a lingua franca on what these things meant. And more importantly, it was hard to find improvements that were part of an integrated process where it was, they were all talking to each other. So understanding where the content comes from and working with your content sourcing team to understand its intention, because you'll create better uses for it if you understand that intention, but you'll also create better metadata, which will reduce friction. So I would highly encourage all of you, if you have not done this, to think about it, doing a sources and uses study. Metadata excellence review sounds obvious, and maybe you do metadata reviews every so often, but reviewing it for what? Are you just looking for it's missing? Are you looking for it's wrong? Or are you looking for it to create value and reduce friction? And you could start with, if we take an MVP approach out of Agile, you could start with a minimum viable product approach by saying, there are only a small number of fields. Think, I don't know how many fields you have for metadata in your DAM, but in all the DAM implementations we did, it was less than 20 fields that mattered, and it was usually 5. That was the rule of thumb that said your asset will get from point A to point B. So you could have 100, and that's great. I remember fighting the good fight at Time Warner Book Group, where it was the new system where all their stuff was going to be. They wanted to put everything in there, including the price of the book. And we were like, why do you need the price of the book in your DAM? Well, we don't have it in one place, and it would be great if we did. Well, that's not a great reason for putting the price of your book in a digital asset management system, and we talked about it. But going back and looking at your metadata to make it, to bring it up to snuff to drive value and reduce friction, I would strongly recommend taking a look at that. And then establish some clear objectives on how to get beyond your understanding of sources and uses and better metadata. Set an agenda with your business stakeholders to establish some clear objectives, hopefully on a quarterly basis. I don't know if you use OKRs, objectives and key results. The book by John Doerr is incredible, so I would highly encourage you to read it. But it's all about, and OKRs are used at Google, OKRs are used at so many different organizations to help drive outcomes at speed. And I think they can really come in handy if you're trying to tie your DAM and your DAM practices and your assets to ROI that the business can understand. And so linking those two things together increasingly is going to be important just in order for us to accomplish the objectives we set out to. These are assets. We have a return on investment from them. Take a look at what your physical or other, if you're in a digital-only business, what other supply chain practitioners are doing. Every once in a while, go benchmark yourself against what they're doing, because they're doing some amazing things in the physical supply chain with digital technologies. In fact, that's called the digital supply chain. And so go look at them and benchmark yourself against the practices that you're doing to get more visibility across the entire spectrum of services that are in play, that interact with you and what you do with your dam and with the folks that are closer to your dam, because it will help inform where the next set of value propositions come from. How am I doing on time, David?
You are doing good.
Perfect. So hopefully you have some questions and or some examples or observations. I'm hoping there's at least one person here who calls it a digital supply chain or thinks about it that way.